Okay, so we are on lesson 4, part 2. I'm just going to be delving further into, first of all, reviewing the different note types we can see on the staff and just identifying them and naming them. And then we're going to be just delving a little bit more into the information that we can glean from the note values that we see on the page, and the information that we cannot glean until we see the note values on an actual staff in the form of a song or a piece that the composer has added additional decoding information to. So let's get started. All right, so as always, we're going to start with review. Remember that writing some of these things could be helpful to deepen your understanding. If you need help with any of this, please just let me know. So let's start by just reviewing that in music we have a staff, and the staff consists of 5 lines and 4 spaces. We count the lines from the bottom, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we count the spaces from the bottom, 1, 2, 3, 4. If we wanted to draw at this point just an X on space 3, we would want to make sure that X fills out the lines from line 3 all the way through line 4, and then it fills out the space completely. And if we wanted to draw an X or a note on line 2, 1, 2, we would just want to make sure the X goes right over top of that line. We learned that we can have a clef sign, the leftmost side of a staff, and this clef sign is going to help us decode the pitches or the letter names that we're supposed to be playing or singing. So remember that we learned about a treble clef. A treble clef starts, if we want to draw it, on line 2. We bump up to line 3, down to line 1, up and around, and back down again. And we remember that a clef sign is always some kind of, there's a code embedded in it. So in this case, all this curly Q action around line 2 helps us mark the spot. X marks the spot. And if we were to put a note head right here, we would know this is called a G. From there, we'll be able to decode all the other letter names once we get to that point in our learning and understanding. So we'll just remember that this is called a treble clef. Sometimes it's called a G clef. And again, these are usually female vocalists and higher instruments like violin, the woodwinds, some of the brass instruments even, and the right hand of the piano would use the treble clef. So then we have another clef sign we learned about, which is a bass clef. And remember, a bass clef would start on line 4 and bump up to line 5 and sort of look like half of a heart. Down just below line 2 is where it's going to stop, and then we put one dot right next to it on in the 4th space, and one dot in the 3rd space. And these dots together help mark the spot of line 4. Line 4 would be an F, and from there again we'll be able to figure out all the other letter names and assign specific pitches to the note heads that we're going to be seeing on the staff. So remember that this can be called either a bass clef or an F clef. All right, so we're going to review the note pyramid or the note value pyramid that we went over in the last video. And the first note we're going to talk about is just the whole note, which is the longest note value in Western music. And it's just represented by an open note head, we call it, or an oval with no filling in it. And we can think of this as being equivalent to a whole pie. We can take that whole pie or that whole note and we can break it down into 2 equal parts. And we represent this with an open note head, but we add a stem to it. So we add one element to help us remember that we are one level of division down. And we will think of this as being worth half of a pie. So a 1/2 note is worth half of the value of a whole note. We can take that half note and we can break it down, and we'll do this just by drawing a half note, but we're going to add, again, one element, which is going to be filling in the note head, okay? So again, we have the stem, the note head, but we're going to also fill it in. Stem, the note head, and fill it in. Filled in note head and a stem. And these are going to be called quarter notes because each of them will be given a quarter of the value of a whole note, a quarter of the duration of a whole note, okay? We can take the quarter note, we can break it down into eighth notes. So 1/8 note is worth half of the value of a quarter note, and 1/8 note is worth 1/8 of the value of a whole note, okay? And we do this by just drawing a quarter note. So a filled in note head with a stem, and then we can either add a beam across the top, or if you remember, if we ever see them separately, we see a quarter note with a little flag, one little flag, okay? We can also see eighth notes sometimes grouped in groups of 3, even 4, depends on, variety of situations, and some of those are theory rules we won't get into about how you can join beats and stuff like that in terms of notation. Don't need to worry about it, just know that it all means the same thing. We're looking for one beam or one flag and what looks like a quarter note besides that. Okay, so again, we'll call these eighth notes. All right, and we could think of it as each note being worth 1/8 of a pi or 1/8 of a whole note, right? And then we can further break those eighth notes down into 2 equal parts. And when we do that, we call them 16th notes. I'm only going to cover over this first group. And we can see that represented with one extra beam. So now you have 2 beams instead of just the one that an eighth note had. Or if we see it as a separate 16th note, we'll see a quarter note with 1 flag, 2 flags. Each of these 16th notes would be worth the value of or worth the duration of a 16th of a whole note. The only information that we can glean from this is a note's fixed relative value, okay? So you notice we're not assigning these notes a specific number of beats. We're not assigning these notes a specific duration, okay? So what we can say from a note pyramid like this is that a whole note will be twice as long as a half note. A half note will be twice as long as a quarter note will be twice as long as an eighth note, and an eighth note will be twice as long as a 16th note, okay? We can also say that this will always be true. A half note is equal to a quarter note plus a quarter note. What we cannot say will always be true is that this half note will be worth 2 beats and this quarter note will be worth 1 beat plus 1 beat. Okay, a lot of people have thought this is true, been taught it was true. It's not, though. The only thing that is true is that a half note is equal to a quarter note plus a quarter note. The reason is, depending on what information the composer gives us on the actual sheet of music, it could just as likely be that instead of each half note getting 2 beats and each quarter note getting 1 beat, it could just as easily be that each half note gets 4 beats and each quarter note gets 2 beats. Could also just as easily be true that each half note is given 8 beats and each quarter note equals 4 beats. This is the area where I find a lot of people come to their score and really do associate a quarter note with 1 beat. And it puts a huge glass ceiling on their ability to understand any time signature, any piece of music that doesn't adhere to this one kind of beat assignment, this one breakdown. All right, so remembering that a note value in and of itself, a whole note, a half note, a quarter note, an eighth note, a 16th note, all it tells us, the only information it really gives us, is its fixed relative value. An actual beat assignment or duration assignment is something the composer assigns and decides, and you cannot know that beat assignment until you actually see these notes on a score, these note shapes or these note types on a score, okay? So remembering what we had gone over, that a whole note is twice as long as a half note. We know that for sure, right? We know that it would take 2 half notes to equal 1 whole note, okay? We also know that a half note is twice as long as a quarter note, and therefore it would take 2 quarter notes to equal 1 half note, right? Likewise, a quarter note is twice as long as an eighth note, and an eighth note is twice as long as a 16th note. And there are actually 2 levels beyond this that we're not even talking about because it doesn't affect us too much on the music team or in choir. So those would be literally 32nd notes and 64th notes, right? And we would just add more beams to show those notes. So let's just come up with a hypothetical situation. If the composer tells us on the score that each 16th note shall be the duration of 10 seconds, okay? Now, this is completely a made-up scenario. That's not how the composers will tell us how long to hold these notes, but let's just say, okay? Let's say 10 seconds. Maybe it's some, 21st century composer who decides to be cool and change up how we convey these things to musicians, how long to hold notes. The rules would still apply, okay? The relative fixed value of these notes would still apply. So we can say that 1 16th note is worth 10 seconds, okay? You should hold that note for 10 seconds. Then we can know from there that therefore an eighth note should be held for 20 seconds each. A quarter note should be held for 40 seconds each. Half note should be 80 seconds, and a whole note should be 160 seconds. Ridiculous scenario, but the point being, it's actually possible for that to happen because the only thing that's fixed in the case of note values is the relative value of these notes. The actual duration, the actual beat assignment given these note values is determined only once a composer gives us additional decoding information, and it is a variable thing. It is not something that's fixed, and if we look at scores with the idea that a quarter note is always 1 beat, and we come at it with that kind of understanding, that's where we hit snags. 2 more examples of how this could work, right? Let's say the composer tells us on the score that he wants an eighth note to get 1 beat. From there, we can figure out that a quarter note must get 2, half note must get 4, and a whole note must get 8 beats. And 8 beats, and a 16th note will just get half of a beat, okay? Another likely scenario is that instead of these numbers, a composer says to us, actually, I want a half note to get 1 beat. So therefore, a whole note will get 2 beats, a quarter note will get half a beat, an eighth note will get just a quarter of a beat, and a 16th note will just get an eighth of a beat. These are both very likely scenarios, and in fact appear in some of the songs we sing at church, and I'm sure some of the songs that choir does as well. So it's worth starting to open our mind to the idea that this is a likely scenario.